Thank you very much for talking to us today. So you're accepting most of the recommendations of the sentencing review. Are you doing that because it's the right thing to do or because you haven't got a choice?
Oh, well, look, when I walked into the Ministry of Justice this time last year, day after the general election, I was confronted with the situation where our prisons were on the point of collapse. And I'm very clear that I cannot allow that to happen, because if we go down to 0 places in our prison system in this country, we would have to say to the police, you can no longer make any arrests. We'd have to stop cases going into the courts. And I think we'd see the total breakdown of law and order in this country. So my view is I have to avoid that at all costs. Any responsible government has to avoid that at all costs. It's a terrible legacy left to me by the previous Conservative government, but I've got to fix this mess. So we are acting because we have to, and because we absolutely cannot risk prisons running out of capacity, getting down to 0 and collapsing.
A big part of these reforms is effectively rewarding good behaviour in prison by letting those people out early and kind of punishing bad behaviour. But I just want to talk about in the context of domestic abuse, because it seems to me that perpetrators of domestic abuse, people who abuse women, are not necessarily the people who are going to get into prison fights or into trouble in prison. They're manipulative often. They can sometimes be quite charming. Just the kind of people who would be released early, and just the kind of people who could ruin the lives of the people who they have committed those crimes against. Do you accept that?
Well, look, I mean, for all victims in this country, and for any future victims, and indeed actually for all of us as citizens in this country, the first responsibility I have...
I'm just talking about specifically on domestic abuse.
But I have to make sure we don't run prisons to the point of collapse. We cannot allow them to collapse. The second thing I would say is, look, I've seen the concept of earned release under this model. I've seen it work in Texas. I went over there to see how their system of good behaviour credit works, and it's been exceptional at cutting reoffending and therefore cutting crime out in communities there. They've seen a drop in their crime and they've got their prisons under control. So I think David has gone where the evidence has taken him. On the specific issues in relation to domestic abuse, what I announced today in the House is, whilst we accept the review's recommendations on the presumption against short sentences, which I know has caused some concern for the violence against women and girls sector and for campaigners and victims, we will exempt from those changes any breach of protective order. So these are the orders that are given out in order to protect women from abusive partners. They will be exempted.
I guess you know, my kind of point about domestic abuse is because domestic abusers know where the victims live, they know where they work, they know where their kids go to school, and if you're a victim of domestic abuse, if you hear the news that, you know, the person who's made your life hell is out and about, it's going to make you fearful, it's going to make you scared. And it's not just me saying this. Nicole Jacobs, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, said this morning, by adopting these measures, the government will be sending a clear message to domestic abusers that they can now offend with little consequence.
No, I understand why victims of domestic abuse, and indeed any victim in our country, will be worried. What I would say to them is we're absolutely clear that we're going to get this prison system under control so that there is always a place in our prisons for dangerous offenders who need to be locked up in order to keep the public safe. Secondly, what I would say is that the earned progression model conceives of a sentence in 3 stages. The first is the custody stage, but the next stage is intensive supervision. I've secured enough money from Treasury, a £700 million uplift in probation funding, and we will use that money on tagging, a huge expansion in tagging of offenders. We'll make sure that we have the probation staffing that we need to keep the public safe and to keep victims safe as well.
You're also looking at chemically castrating sex offenders. Can you just explain to me what actually is chemical castration?
Well, look, it's a method of using 2 different types of drugs that tackle 2 different ways in which sex offenders engage in this behaviour, invasive thoughts as well as libido.
So what is it? Is it like a pill or an injection?
Yes, it's medication, and there's 2 different types of it, and the different types will vary according to the type.
So it stops you wanting to have sex. Is that basically what it does?
So it deals with the invasive thoughts that are around, constantly thinking about problematic sexual behaviour and problematic sexual arousal.
And does it last forever? Is it permanent?
You have to keep taking the medication. The evidence, and these studies are quite small in number. There's not a huge evidence base here in terms of what we've got available to us in this country. But the evidence suggests that the combination of the drugs with psychological interventions is actually the best combination for ultimately reducing reoffending. What I've inherited from previous administrations is a very, very small-scale pilot that's been running for some years in the Southwest. What I've decided is I think that this is a combination of medicine and psychological interventions that other countries are using to good effect. So more and more countries are taking this up. I'm not squeamish about doing this here, so I would like to see a national rollout of the current programme that we have. We're going to start with 2 regions and then progress to national rollout. It's a voluntary programme to start with, but I'm also exploring, whether mandation might be a way forward for us as well.
To force people to do it. Are you worried about miscarriage of justice at all?
Well, look, any system you'd have to design properly so that you are dealing with sex offenders, people who are proved to be sex offenders, and at the moment it's a voluntary system. So these are people who accept that they've got a problem and who are willing to go down this road of chemical suppression as well as psychological interventions.
And I feel like I'm rattling through this, but this is such an important issue. There's so many different things I want to talk to you about, and I did just want to ask you a question on community service as well. Because you talk about council street cleaning, filling potholes. And one thing that has always stayed with me, actually, was some years ago, but I read a letter into a newspaper from somebody who worked for the council, and they said they found it quite offensive when criminals were being punished by having to do the same job that they did for their actual job. And I just wonder, is there something in that? I mean, it's not really a punishment, is it, to make people do work that's people's daily lives?
That's an interesting perspective, but I do disagree with it because I think it's important for offenders to engage in activity that clearly shows the community they're paying back. There's a reparations
but it's
element.
Not really paying back. It's not really a punishment. This is what people's...
But these are jobs that need doing, right? So we will work with... What I've announced today is we will work with local authorities and fill some of the gaps that they have in the provision of public services, whether that's filling potholes or cleaning our streets or doing other work. But I will also in the next few weeks be sitting down with private employers to think about whether we can have a model where offenders do work for private companies and the salary that they would have been paid for that work actually gets paid into a victims fund instead.
I just want to talk about some of the wider issues around this because I spent some time, as you know, filming in Preston Prison, and it did really genuinely change my perspective on a lot of this stuff. It was the same people in prison. They started off when they were 17, 18, they kept coming back and again, and a lot of the officers were frankly saying that some of these people shouldn't be in prison. And just looking at the numbers, statistics show the prison population has doubled since 1993. I mean, do you think the UK has become twice as dangerous in that time?
Well, look, I think that... Look, I believe in prison and I think prison has a place. And what you've seen in Preston is a prison system that's not working at the moment. And part of my job is to make sure that we run prisons that do the job they're supposed to do, punish offenders, but then also help rehabilitate them so you don't get people coming out. But that's not what prisons are doing.
But they're not. It's not working, is it?
Well, when you run a system at boiling hot, which is what the Conservative Party did for most of their time in office, it's actually very difficult when prisons are so full and on the brink of overflowing to run the sorts of regimes where you can actually start to make a difference. You're absolutely right. At the moment, our prisons create better criminals rather than better citizens. 80% of offenders are reoffenders. That's why you saw so many people cycling in and out of the system when you were in Preston. We do have to turn that around.
Because I know I'm thinking back to when Tony Blair said, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. And today it feels like all the talk is about prisons and there's not very much at all about the causes of crime. You know, the fact that the majority of young people in prison went to care, right? You know, the fact that half of crime is driven by drugs, the fact that so many people are going to prison not able to read. You know, it feels like you're like hurtling from emergency to emergency without tackling some of the root causes that are causing the system to be at the point of collapse.
Well, what I would say is, of course, I've got to stop the system from collapsing, but we are also taking measures on reducing reoffending as well. We recognise that having 80% of offenders who are re-offenders is just a shocking statistic, and it's an indictment of the failures of the prison system in this country.
You're not talking about the causes of crime, and you're also letting sex offenders out of jail early. Is there a risk that this is a government that is not tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime, but weak on crime and weak on the causes of crime?
No, I absolutely reject that, because what I think is weak on crime is letting your prisons get to the point of collapse in the first place. So, I absolutely reject that. We're going to build prisons. We will fill those prison places because we need to, in order to meet the demand coming into the system for prison places. But we also have to do better on rehabilitation. We've accepted the recommendations that David Gork has made on greater use of intensive supervision courts. This is where you have a judge who really works closely with an offender to make sure that they keep them on the straight and narrow. They engage with their drug treatment programs or their alcohol treatment programs. They engage with other rehabilitative activity. All of the early work in this country shows huge promise. We will see an expansion of intensive supervision courts. So I think for different cohorts of offenders, we will start to make a difference on that very important work of reducing reoffending and tackling the root causes as well.
Thank you very much.